Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So, today I wanted to talk about some controversial book related, fiction novel related opinions. Mostly because I've seen a few videos about these specific opinion takes or subjects, and I wanted to make a video on my own. And most of these videos are kind of old, or at least a year or at least a few months. I feel like maybe the booktube community has not necessarily fallen off or becoming less unpopular, but it's definitely not, it doesn't have as much controversy and as much drama, if you will. I think maybe in the last few years as it did before, or maybe it's just my perception based on the people that I follow and I don't follow, I don't know, but I feel like a few years ago it was definitely focused on strong discussion, sometimes in bad faith and sometimes not. I do remember there being a time where some specific people's takes and videos were kind of discussed around. And interestingly, I'm not sure if those people are necessarily popular or not, but it really seemed that saying anything that could be taken the wrong way would make you be discussed over and over. And probably because the community was kind of smaller back then, it was definitely getting bigger, but it was a little bit smaller. And maybe most of the drama is going on the TikTok place, where the book TikTok, I guess. And I would have done the thing of like asking for your unpopular opinions and then reacting to them and giving my thoughts on them. But I don't really have that many followers, so I won't have that many responses if I had asked for opinions on a video or on Instagram or anything like that. So I'm just kind of going by the ones that I saw other people talk about, the subjects and the questions that I saw other people discuss on their videos. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is audiobooks and ebooks and the discussion on whether or not they can be considered to be really reading or whatever, or they're basically the same thing. Are they equivalent? Are they not? I don't think there's much discussion when it comes to ebooks, but there's people who think that there's something sacred about the physical object of a book, right? Really, the only difference I think is convenience. You can carry a lot of books with you when you have a Kindle or something like that. I know that some people do personally like the feeling and I guess the smell of a book or whatever, all these different parts that make the experience of a book. But I feel like those kinds of things are more subjective and they don't necessarily reflect on whether one thing is superior or inferior. I mean, yeah, you don't have to charge physical books, but if you want to read a physical book in darkness, you have to light something else, whereas a Kindle, you don't really need to light it. You don't need another light. You can just use the light of the Kindle itself or whatever other device you might have. When it comes to audiobooks, I still think it's a little bit different because overall, of course, reading with your eyes is usually more active and listening is more passive, which is also why it's often very convenient to listen to audiobooks because you can use them, you can listen to them while you're doing something mundane that doesn't require too much thinking, like washing the dishes or cleaning something. But I also think that when you read a book physically, you have to process the words yourself and you associate your own tone and really kind of the connotation of the words yourself without really much more influence other than the actual words themselves and the context that you might have for the book itself. But when you hear it, when you listen to it as an audiobook, you have someone else's voice and their intonation, the way they say things. It is a little bit different, and that might give you a different experience from the one you would have had if you had read the book with your own voice going on in your head, which of course is not a huge difference. I mean, in the scope of reading in general, it doesn't really matter that much. But I do find as well that sometimes when you hear the words out loud, especially when the writing style isn't really good or the dialogue is a little bit flat, it often sounds even more ridiculous when it's spoken out loud than if you were to read the words on a page. I don't know why that happens, but I think it's one of those things that I think when you're a writer, you probably read at some point or heard at some point that people telling you as a piece of advice, like, whatever you write, if you read it out loud and it doesn't sound good, delete it and rewrite it, because then that means it's not well written, which I don't necessarily agree with fully, but I do find that bad writing styles and especially bad dialogue jump out even more when you're listening to it. Another kind of more lighthearted thing is when it comes to paperbacks versus hardcovers. I think paperbacks maybe are a little better. It's kind of a difficult choice in reality. They're cheaper, of course. They're easier to hold if you want to hold the whole thing at once, you know what I mean? And they're also lighter, of course, easier to carry around. And also something that I do dislike about hardcovers is that they often have the sleeve outside, and I feel like that's really cumbersome and kind of unnecessary, and I think a lot of the times I really have this urge to just like chuck the sleeve in the trash, because I don't want to have something extra attached, not even attached, just kind of over the book itself. I mean, hardcovers are nicer feeling and they do last more, I guess. And I do like hardcovers whenever I can find them secondhand, especially because usually when you find them secondhand, they don't have the sleeve anymore. Another one is this idea of characters being more important than the plot. And I wouldn't necessarily say that as a whole they're more important, but I do agree for the most part that characters can almost carry a whole book by themselves, whereas, at least in comparison to plot, because of course there are other things in a story, in a novel, or in any type of fiction other than just characters and plot. I think a book can be, a novel at least, can be good if it doesn't have necessarily the most interesting characters, but it does have an interesting plot, good pacing, things like that. But I don't think a book can truly be great without having interesting characters. If the characters are flat, then that can make for a book with a lot of qualities, but still one that doesn't feel very satisfying. I'm just, out of the top of my head, I'm thinking of Childhood's End. I remember that, there's a lot of concepts in the book that are really interesting, a lot of ideas are thrown at you, and really there's a lot of interesting phenomena that are going on in this book. Everything in that book is pretty impressive, except for the characters. Like, the characters just kind of, they just feel like nothing, they just feel like vessels that the author put in place to have the story go on, because someone has to have the story happen, so those are going to be the characters, I guess. And I guess there are people who think that's a valid way to write a story, but I don't know, I feel like it would be ideal if the characters do feel all fleshed out and like real people, even if the focus of the story is something else. The thing is that if you make a character-driven story, the characters do have to be interesting, they have to be very fleshed out, and that's not an easy thing to do, and that's something that some writers don't really, maybe are not extremely careful of. Or I guess they might think that their characters are more developed than they really are. And when a character-driven book doesn't have interesting characters, that's pretty much a guarantee that the book is going to suck, because what else is it going to fall back on? If it's not plot focused and the characters are not interesting, if they feel flat, if they're too archetypal, because being archetypal itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes you can overdo it. Or if they just feel like cardboard cutouts, then don't make it a character-driven story, because you're putting all your eggs in one basket and then you drop the basket. One idea, or something that I think is a bit more controversial, is the question on whether or not you should read classics throughout your life, whether it's something that is necessary, obligatory, or whatever. There seems to be this really strong divide, not just in the booktube community, but it seems that in any kind of book-related or reading-related communities, there's often this divide between the groups of people who mostly read classics or literary fiction, and the people who read YA, mostly YA, middle grade, genres like that. Really, most people, aren't entirely in one group or the other. In fact, I think that most booktubers that I have seen that mostly read classics or literary fiction also read YA once in a while. And also most YA booktubers that I have seen do read classics once in a while too, or literary fiction once in a while. But there's often this idea that people who mostly read classics or literary fiction or maybe other more respectable genres like science fiction and things like that, that those people are pretentious and that they look down on the readers of other things. And there's also the other idea that people who mostly read things like YA, new adult, middle grade, urban fantasy, even self-help books are, things that are often considered to be more lowbrow, at least by people who mostly read classics. From what I've seen, there's that idea that maybe those people are more shallow or they're not very critical readers because everything they read is too digestible. And I've seen a few people who mostly read YA and, things that are associated with it have this idea that literary fiction or classics are overly complicated and that those books are themselves pretentious, like they're trying to be confusing and obscure, or that they're just overall going to be boring or much longer than they need to be. All these ideas are maybe do apply to some books that fall into these categories, but for the most part I feel that are just kind of unfounded. And that maybe these people have these ideas because they have read or started to read a few books of that genre, which they're not exactly genres, I guess, but a few books that fall into the categories of classic or literary fiction, and they found them to be unnecessarily confusing or too long for what they deserve to be or anything like that, and then they figure that that's just kind of what makes the general genre and that those books aren't worth reading. And I've also seen people who mostly read classics or literary fiction say or imply that people who mostly read YA are just too scared to read anything else because they either are or think they are not smart enough to read them, or because they're just lazy readers, or because they just don't care about the depth that can be taken from a book, things of the sort, which are a little bit condescending. And I'm not going to get into any discussion on whether or not these people are real readers or not. I mean, that's a discussion that's not going to get anywhere. I think if your hobbies include reading, you are a reader. I do have to say that I find it a bit strange whenever someone says that they, as a rule, don't read classics or literary fiction at all unless they have to or they have had to, like for school or what have you. And the reason why it's strange to me is because it just seems odd that you see all of these books that are very well known and that people think are really either interesting, weird, or discussion worthy, and that you are not curious about them at all. And don't get me wrong, like classics aren't inherently great, and I think that most classic readers do know that just because a book is especially old doesn't make it great. And I think that's also a misconception that maybe some people have about classics readers, that they always just give some sort of inherent value to a book, or they associate some status to a book just because it's from a certain era or it's especially old or whatever. But I think that if you have read enough classics, you know that they're not all good. I do think that you should ideally read classics once in a while. I'm not giving like a specific number, but get a good feel of what different types of classics are, because of course classic is not a genre. Some classics fall into science fiction, some are basically fantasy, some are more like realism, or I guess slice of life stuff, if you will. Some are basically romance or tragedy, or there's different things that are going on in a classic. Just because they're especially old doesn't mean that they should be expected to have a specific type of writing style or a specific type of subjects or a specific way of writing. We're talking about so many different eras in history and from different places that there's just no way that you can read a couple classics and assume that you know all that there is to know about them, and that's why you don't want to associate with them anymore. And of course, I'm not forcing you to do anything. I mean, I'm just one person on the internet, but I can assure you that if you go through a list whether on Goodreads or blogs or different things like that, or YouTube videos, you will eventually find at least a few classics that you are interested in and that you will potentially really like. And I think it also feels strange to me because it's like you're missing out on a very long time of books being written, I mean, classics, the past is such a long time in total, right? Like, most of human history is in the past, right? Obviously. So you're basically missing out on a lot of stuff that has been written before. One thing that I will say about classics specifically is that sometimes the readers do take themselves a little bit too seriously, or the books that they like, that they have read a little too seriously. Like I've harshly criticized quite a few different books that fall into genre books or YA books or contemporary books that are necessarily literary fiction and obviously are not classics. And I haven't really, that I can remember, I haven't really received any like strongly negative or insulting or condescending comments from those videos. Whereas whenever I criticize a classic, even when I don't give it 1 star, even in reviews where I have given it 3 stars, I get at least a couple of pretty hostile comments telling me that I'm basically stupid and that I should go back to reading Twilight or whatever. And of course that could also be because those books are more well known, so those videos are probably gonna get more views and therefore are more likely to get negative comments. However, I have criticized also some really popular YA or generally non-literary fiction and non-classic books before, and I haven't really gotten that many negative comments that I can remember. And of course that's anecdotal, right? But I think there might be a pattern there. Another thing that I want to touch on is the idea of reading for enjoyment versus reading critically. I made a video where I discussed basically with myself on whether I think that maybe I am too negative or too harsh with reviewing books or with reading them overall. And because I was having kind of a bad reading year where everything that I read was consistently 1, 2, maybe 3 stars. But throughout the year, it started to make sense to me that a lot of the books that I was reading, I gave 3 stars to, because 3 stars is basically, or 2.5 really, is kind of average. If you rate a book 2.5, you're basically saying it's not the greatest, it's not the worst, which means it's kind of a middle ground, it's kind of an average book. And by definition, most books are going to be average. There's only a few that are going to stand out as being especially great or especially bad, and I would say that unfortunately it's more common to have books that are especially bad because of course making a great book, writing a great book takes a lot of effort. But in terms of reading for enjoyment versus reading critically, I would say that they're not exactly two different extremes. I've seen that a few people sometimes get this comment. Of course, my channel isn't nearly, big enough to get those types of comments, but sometimes people do ask them, like, do you even like anything? Do you even like any books? And of course, these people do like reading. I mean, that's why they do it so much. And if you look for books that they do like, you will find them. But I think there's this idea that if most of the books you read, you don't give 4 stars or 5 stars to, that means that you're basically wasting your time reading in the first place. So my name is Marines made a video talking about this same thing, basically, the fact that there are not two different extremes, reading for enjoyment and reading critically, and that sometimes enjoyment actually has a lot to do with whether you would rate a book highly or not. And in fact, I would say that a lot of the aspects that most people, including me, would use to review books, to rate them, have a lot to do with enjoyment. For example, more fleshed out characters make for a more immersive experience, reading experience, world building that has logic, that doesn't have too many contradictions. It doesn't require you to force yourself to suspend your disbelief that much, which of course again has a lot to do with the experience and the enjoyment of reading. A story that isn't too predictable also has you more invested in what's going to happen next. All these things just have a lot to do with enjoyment and are also associated with the rating of the book. Usually people will cite these different things these different factors when they talk about why a book is good or not, at least when it comes to things like fiction, which are strongly tied to entertainment. And sometimes this critique is what helps you explain why you enjoyed something or why you didn't enjoy it. If I gave most books that I read 4 or 5 stars, then giving a book 4 or 5 stars wouldn't really mean that much. And I also feel like being a bit harsher with, the media that you consume is just kind of the natural consequence of reading enough things or reading things in a certain way for a long enough time. And it's not like I have the, world's record of most books read in my life. I would say they would be maybe 200 at most in total, which isn't really that much if you consider the total for a lot of booktubers out there. But I have been writing for a very long time, and I have been hearing all of these writing tips that have been really helpful for me and that have made my writing something that I feel much more proud of. And that's been going on for such a long time, way before I even started to have this idea of reviewing books on the internet or anything like that. And when I started to read all these books and review them, I started to realize why people gave these specific writing tips, because they do make your writing more vivid and more interesting. And I don't consider myself to be especially negative, in all honesty, when it comes to reviewing books, partly because I pretty much always find something positive to say about a book, and partly because I often see negative reviews for books that I don't like at all, and I feel like the reasons for disliking them are not valid. Sometimes I feel like, certain arguments, I'm like, that doesn't really make any sense. Of course, I sometimes do agree, because usually their grievances, or at least a lot of the times their problems with the book, are the same ones that I had, or some of them at least are basically the same. But sometimes I feel like a book that I don't like is being reviewed, or it's being criticized unfairly or overly, in a way that is overly harsh. And of course, that doesn't necessarily make those reviews bad and too overly negative in comparison, but that just goes to show that we all have different reasons for disliking books, and we don't just all start to, just because we're, I guess, book reviewers, or we, critique books as a hobby, that doesn't mean that we're all just one group that is waiting to shit on one book because we don't think it's highbrow enough for us or whatever. So that's pretty much all I have to say, and I hope this starts some sort of discussion, whether here or on different videos. And yeah, I hope that you found this interesting or helpful or entertaining, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.